Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom after our extended hiatus on Christmas break, right? Welcome back to your flipped classroom where we're going to jump right back into where we left off during the Reign of Terror and continue our discussion about the French Revolution, its effects, and the eventual rise of Napoleon, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, that I want to go ahead and put out there is, I'm very well aware that I have yet to finish grading your exams, and I'm also very well aware that your grades have not been updated yet. They will be completely updated by tomorrow. I am recording this right now on January 2nd currently, okay? So they will be completely updated by January 3rd, and you'll know exactly where you stand and where everything sits, all right? I apologize about this taking so long. I apologize about taking so long to get this flip up there as well, but I think in light of recent events and stuff like that have affected my life and people that are in it, and the other thing that we need to understand is that my trip to North Carolina just took way longer than I expected, right? So in light of that, you will only have one flip, all right? It will just be this one. It'll be a little bit longer than normal, but we're going to try and go over as much of the stuff from Unit 5 as possible, and if we don't kill Napoleon right now, then we'll kill him by the first day of him back in class. It's not a big deal, right? So it's not a big deal whatsoever, and we'll just keep on cruising. And like I said, we're over a week ahead of where I was last year, so let's keep crushing it, all right? But where we left off in our last class, right before our last test and right before our last exam, is we had descended into what is known as the French Reign of Terror, right? During the French Revolution, the years of 1793 to 1794, that would be characterized by massive amounts of change and massive amounts of bloodshed throughout the French Revolution, right? This is where they're going to change all that different stuff, where they're going to change all the months and days of the weeks and their names. All the months are going to have 30 days. They canceled Christianity, a big thing that we need to kind of remember in the back of our head. And instead of having Christianity, they inducted this idea of the cult of the supreme being, which is a process known as de-Christianization, right? They closed churches, they dropped Sundays, they had 10-day long weeks and only had one weekend day. They set the price of bread. That's going to be really big as well. Just kind of keep that in mind, like price setting and aggressive government intervention. They're also going to draft every single man into the French army that can serve between the ages of 18 and 25, known as the levée en masse, right? Because what France is going through currently at this point in time in history is this thing known as the Wars of the Coalitions, right? Where they are fighting against the rest of Europe and the forces of England, the Netherlands, Prussia, and Austria, and all these other large groups coming together to go against France to try and stop their revolution from spreading to the rest of the continent. Now, they are also going to strip a lot of rights from women, because something we need to understand is that the rights are only temporary. We'll see this happen again under the reign of Napoleon. They're also going to introduce a dress code where everyone is forced to wear an item of red clothing every single day, right? Robespierre, Danton, and Marat had anyone that opposed the revolution executed, right? That is why it's characterized as the Reign of Terror, right? Because literally the idea was using fear to try and control people, their habits, and even some of their speech, right? To try and make sure that they understood that counter-revolutionaries would never rise up against them. So here's the thing you have to understand about the Reign of Terror, is that was its entire idea, was to try and prevent these people known as counter-revolutionaries, right? That we'll talk about a little bit later in this flip as well. What a counter-revolutionary was is somebody that might undo the progress of the revolution or try to bring it to an end or close, right? Counter-revolutionaries were particularly seen in the ranks of the Girondins, which is one of the clubs that we had talked about, which was a break-off of the Jacobins and stuff like that. The Girondins were accused of being counter-revolutionaries, so a large number of them are going to be executed, right? And this is going to create a sweeping fear that's going to go throughout all of France, and it's going to lead to a very unstable period, right? When you look at the years 1793 to 1794, the years that the Reign of Terror actually was being led by what is known as the Committee of Public Safety, right? That is going to have the ranks of Danton and Robespierre in it. Then you're also going to have Marat as a sidebar as well, okay? He was actually in this thing called the Committee of Treason and also the Committee of public information and whatnot. So the thing that you have to understand though, it's a very short time period, right? Only lasting about a year. And it's because that within that year and this aggressive time of this thing known as the Reign of Terror, a lot of these leaders are going to end up dead. When a lot of them, I mean all of them, right? Danton, Robespierre, and Marat would see their untimely ends during this entire process. Marat, actually right here, as you can see, is going to be stabbed to death, right? He actually was stabbed by a Girondin sympathizer in his collarbone right here with about a 7-inch long kitchen blade by this woman named Charlotte Corday, right? Charlotte Corday literally came up and was like, the fear is destroying the French people. It is destroying, the Reign of Terror is destroying the progress of the revolution, and she refused to stand for for it. She came from a very rural French village all the way to Paris, set up a meeting with Marat, where she then infiltrated his room where he was sitting in his medical bath. She took a knife and stabbed him one time right under his clavicle, nicking an artery, and ended up killing him, right? So she is going to be, of course, arrested immediately during this process. But what this event, or the death of Marat, symbolizes to us is how no one during the Reign of Terror is safe, not even the people leading it, right? And that painting right there is actually by a very famous figure known as Jacques-Louis David, who we will talk about a little bit later in this flip, or actually in our next class as well. So what we're going to end up getting into, though, is this period of extreme executions, right? A lot of famous people are going to be executed during the Reign of Terror, right? Because the executions were considered public, like, practice, and were considered very educational, right? One of them, for example, is going to be none other than Charlotte Corday, the woman that actually stabbed Marat to death, right? Who is a Girondin sympathizer. She will be executed via guillotine very soon after her entire, like, arrest from, like, stabbing Marat and her subsequent trial. At her trial, she was actually asked, "Ma'am, why did you do this?" And she said, "I killed one man to save 100,000, right? So she was basically emphasizing that he needed to die for the safety of others, right? Other people that are going to be executed include Marie Antoinette, right? Of course, the queen that actually up to this point in our learning has still managed to survive. She will end up being executed though in October of 1793. Her very last words being, "I'm sorry," when she actually stepped on the executioner's foot before she was then summarily executed and then made a public spectacle of, right? Other big one is the guy by the name of Antoine Lavoisier, who y'all learned about in your chemistry class, who is actually one of the early tax collectors of the French Revolution. He was a member of the Second Estate, a noble figure, and then also he discovered all the known elements at the time. But he ends up dying. Go ahead and bring that up to Miss Holmes in your next class, right? That he actually ends up dying and being executed via guillotine as well. Another big one was Georges Danton. Who saw that coming? All right, so now what ends up happening, though, is Georges Danton, who is the right-hand man of Maximilien Robespierre, was accused of basically trying to stop the revolution, overturn its progress, and to try and prevent the new republic that was being established. So he ends up actually being seen as a traitor, tried for treason, and is executed by Maximilien Robespierre as well, all right? And he ends up meeting his fate at the guillotine, or by the hands of the guillotine, before the end of 1793. Now, public executions were considered educational at this time, right? These executions, as you can tell, have massive crowds around them, okay? Because people were invited to come and watch. For example, whenever Louis XVI was executed, someone literally soaked up some of his blood in a handkerchief and shoved it inside of a gourd, which is absolutely wild. But the Committee of Public Safety is going to actually do a lot of crazy stuff at these things. For example, they're going to encourage women to bring their children to these executions so the kids can see what happens if you actually go against the revolution. Toy guillotines would be given out to kids in the crowd, and women were encouraged to knit while they were actually having the parade of executions every single day, right? The Committee of Public Safety, though, in this process is going to arrest over 300,000 people during the Reign of Terror. We believe 10,000 of them probably died in prison, and we believe that 17,000 of them are going to be officially executed, right? Now, the thing about it, notice that word officially right there is going to be pretty important because the number is probably actually much higher, right? And that 10,000 plus that 27,000 shows us that 27,000 people will be actually executed or end up having their death brought to them during the Reign of Terror, which is an extremely aggressive number. You're talking about close to 30,000 people dying during this time period, right? Now, this is very, very also, it kind of keys into why the Reign of Terror wasn't very sustainable and why it's only going to last for about a year and a half. It's mostly due to the fact that literally this carnage and bloodshed was just so aggressive, right? Which is going to end up bringing about as well the most famous execution of all during the Reign of Terror, and that being the execution of Maximilien Robespierre himself, right? Maximilien Robespierre had created a system that was being ran by the Committee of Public Safety and the new National Convention, and they were actually using aggressive tactics to try and prevent people from overthrowing the revolution. Well, what ends up happening is during the month of Thermidor, which is known as the hot month, all right, or July, actually, when we're looking at the old French calendar from the revolutionary period, during the month of Thermidor, there was an event known as the Thermidorian Reaction, where a group of men decided that they would overthrow Maximilien Robespierre, have him arrested on counts of treason and also collusion, and they would have him executed to try and bring an end to the carnage and bloodshed of the Reign of Terror. This is actually a picture or an artist rendering of that moment when they actually have his arrest warrant. They're brandishing it before him and his brother. His brother then actually ended up leaping to his death and jumping out of the window of the Hotel de Ville and dying, and Maximilien Robespierre right here is getting shot in the face. All right, so now what ends up happening actually is, according to Maximilian Robespierre, he took the gun and actually stuck it in his mouth, his own weapon, stuck it in his mouth, and whenever he was being arrested, his arm was hit, and the bullet actually came out the side of his face, and that's what ended up happening, is why he had a hole in his face, is according to him. But according to the guy that arrested him, he said he shot at him, and then the bullet went into his mouth and then out the side of his face. We'll never really know, though, because literally he ends up dead and beheaded like only about 48 hours later. The Reign of Terror, though, what it demonstrates to us is unsustainable, right? Eventually people grew tired of the bloodshed and the carnage, and they're going to start turning to some really like more like docile tactics, right? They're wanting to bring around an end to the revolution, all right? And according to many academics, in 1794, that is going to be the last year of the revolution. Several different professors and a lot of different figures are actually going to kind of mark out 1794 as being the end of the chaotic and radical phase, and some of them believe that the revolution came to an end there. Now, I personally believe that the revolution didn't officially end until 1815 at the end of the reign of Napoleon, but that's arguable, right? Now, the cops, though, or also known as the Committee of Public Safety, died with Robespierre, and when he died, after that, a 5-man executive branch known as the Directory would come into power, right? And this executive branch would be very, very boring, ineffective, and last for about 5 years, and it's something that I don't even talk about, right? But France chose to focus on war during this time period because they were still fighting these many different wars of the coalitions against the combined forces of the European continent, and they wanted to try and spread the changes gained by the revolution, right? So something that we need to understand is that the revolutionary progress is still kind of there, right? And you're seeing a very, very large adoption of a lot of these different revolutionary reforms, right? But going into it, though, we have to understand that there are major effects of the French Revolution up to this point in time, right? So looking at it, though, we need to understand that there are both political effects of the revolution, and there are also going to be some geopolitical / sociological effects of the revolution as well, okay? So looking at abroad, right, we're going to look at this both abroad and locally. We're going to look outside of Europe and then inside of Europe, and how the French Revolution is beginning to change what is known as the status quo at the time, right? The status quo being, of course, that you have a monarchy, a strong central monarch, and you have an absolutist government, or possibly a constitutional government, and you have feudalism and serfs and stuff like that still hanging around or whatever. Now, France, though, has dramatically changed this entire concept, right? And the goals of the revolution are really shaking up the culture of Europe, right? And so one of the biggest changes abroad that ends up happening is the revolution that occurs in a colony that belonged to France at the time, known as Saint-Domingue, right? Saint-Domingue is what you now, in the modern era, call Haiti, right? Haiti being on the island of Hispaniola, which is now current in the modern day shared with the Dominican Republic, right? Now, what we need to understand, though, is about that colony is it made a ridiculous amount of money for France, right? Whenever France actually owned this colony, and they were going to own it all the way up until 1804. What the thing we need to understand by that, though, is they made a slew of money off of it because they controlled about about 80% of the world's sugar, and about 60% of the world's coffee was grown inside of Haiti, okay? Or excuse me, at the time, Saint-Domingue, right? So what we need to understand, though, is that it was a heavy slave-based plantation economy, right? And this is going to be a very, very chaotic plantation economy because it had a very, very crappy social infrastructure to it, and it had a very, very bad class system that it actually used, but also the work that was entailed for making sugar and coffee is backbreaking amounts of labor, and so the slaves are going to have frequent revolts, okay? So something we need to understand is that this island is going to be subject to a large number of slave revolts throughout most of its history. Well, the biggest one that ends up happening is in the early 1790s, during the earliest phases of the revolution, right around 1793, this man right here, named Toussaint Louverture, is going to overtake a slave revolt because, being a former slave in Haiti himself, he is going to try and use his education and his Enlightenment-style education to take over the slave revolt and try to lead it in the direction of the abolition of slavery. Something we need to understand about Toussaint Louverture is he actually takes hold of this revolution or takes hold of this slave revolt with the goal of having slavery abolished in Saint-Domingue, okay? And he is inspired by the French Revolution, so that is why it's a major effect of the French Revolution, right? Because in 1789, the French Revolution itself begins, which will inspire the slave revolt that actually happened in the French colony as well, due to the instability back in France, and then also just as well as demonstrating Enlightenment-style ideals, right? The organized slave revolt then is going to take over the island, and the Committee of Public Safety during 1794 is going to actually, and the National Assembly is going to actually abolish slavery in Saint-Domingue. So Toussaint is actually very successful, and Saint-Domingue has slavery abolished, right? But what's going to end up happening, though, is later on, Napoleon would intend to reinstate slavery and fail because Haiti became an independent country in 1804, right? And that's one big reason why Napoleon is a turd, right? But what we need to understand, though, is the French Revolution will inspire a very large revolt that goes down in Saint-Domingue, which eventually leads to it abolishing slavery and then also becoming an independent country known as Haiti, right? Now, back in Europe, though, some other effects of the French Revolution are going to be very important, particularly when we're starting to see a split, particularly in sociological understandings of politics in Europe and then also political perspectives, all right? So what we're seeing happening right now is a split in basically how many people in Europe and how many scholars and like different learned individuals in Europe are beginning to view how European society should progress after the French Revolution is beginning to come to a close. Many of them believe that they should continue on the track with a strong absolutist government and none of this like shenanigans of Enlightenment style ideals, where many others are actually saying, no, we should pursue those Enlightenment ideas even further, right? And so that right there is your split, right? And so what you're seeing is several different groups pop up, right? One of them being conservatives, the other one being classical liberals and socialists. These are two different groups of people that actually go more towards the other end of Enlightenment style ideas, right? So what you're seeing though, like I said, is basically conservatives and progressives include both classical liberals and socialists at the time. Now, when we're looking at this, we actually can look at a couple of different key figures throughout this entire movement that demonstrate to us how some people are going to want to go back to the old ways of Europe and the way things always have been, because absolutists didn't allow revolutions and people didn't die by 30,000 people during the Reign of Terror, right? And the guys like that are going to be like this dude right here named Edmund Burke, right? And then you also have this woman right here named Mary Wollstonecraft, who is actually the mother of Mary Shelley, who is, because it's Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who actually wrote the Frankenstein, which is a really, really cool thing that we'll talk about a little bit later. And then going into it, though, Mary Wollstonecraft is going to be a good example of a classical liberal. And then Henri de Saint-Simon right there is going to be a great example of a socialist at the time, right? Because you're going to see people like Edmund Burke show up and say, nothing turns out to be so oppressive and unjust as a feeble government, because he believed that the French Revolution led to the Reign of Terror and the large-scale death and execution of people. And then also he believed that if the revolution was allowed to spread, it would end up toppling several different governments and undoing old orders that actually he believed kept people safe. That is the conservative perspective, right? Then you have people like Mary Wollstonecraft, a classical liberal, who thought it was a glorious chance to obtain more virtue and happiness around the globe, right? Because particularly she focused on the rights gained by women during the revolution. And then Henri de Saint-Simon said to each according to their ability, because he believed that socialism was the progressive state of like the world, and he believed that that's the direction that things should keep going, right? These concepts will all be massive as we go forward, right? Now, you don't necessarily need to write down those quotes, but I'm just trying to give you an understanding that people like Edmund Burke, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Henri de Saint-Simon disagreed on how the world should progress following something like the French Revolution, right? But now what we're doing is we are moving into a very, very pivotal moment throughout history, and it's going to affect all of you on a daily mother flipping basis, right? We are now talking about the rise of none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, right? The young soldier that had showed up in 1785 in the French military, who would eventually rise to become Emperor of France, who also now has a shopping center on West Napoleon Avenue named after him, right? Which is absolutely wild. And many of you probably pass by it whenever you're heading home, right? So the thing about it, though, that we need to understand is that Napoleon Bonaparte is going to be the final phase of the French Revolution, right? Of course, none other than known as the Napoleonic phase, right? Napoleon Bonaparte, though, is a very intense figure. He's one of the most intense and pivotal people inside of all of the European history, and you could argue that European history has but two phases, right? The years before Napoleon and the years after Napoleon, right? Now, Napoleon himself, kind of a turd that if I actually met in the afterlife, I would punch him in the face, all right? Because he's not a very nice guy. But going into it, what he's going to end up doing, though, is he's going to bring radical changes to the rest of Europe. He is going to spread these revolutionary ideals throughout Europe, and he's also going to end up taking over about 80% of Europe and end up really, really shaking things up in a major way. The things that Napoleon is going to cause in European history are going to be absolutely massive, all right? So what we need to understand about Napoleon Bonaparte, though, is where the heck did this guy come from? Now, I could talk to you all day long about a lot of different things about Napoleon, but the College Board doesn't want me to because they're little turds and they're boring, all right? Well, the thing about it that you need to understand, though, we'll give you a little bit of background about him, though. Napoleon was born Not even French, all right? Fun fact, he was actually from a very small island known as Corsica, which is actually off the coast of Italy. So when he grew up, he actually grew up speaking Italian, right? Not even speaking French. But later on, what's going to happen is the French are going to take over the island of Corsica, and he will eventually become a subject of the French state. He later on, when he gets a little bit older, he goes to military school in France. He ends up graduating with honors, mostly due to the fact that he got picked on a lot, and he ended up just doing nothing but studying, which is like a whole other thing. He got picked on a lot because he spoke French with an Italian accent, and also he was a little bit on the shorter side. And so the thing about it, though, is like fun fact, he actually wasn't short. He was actually like average height at the time. He was about 5'7", which is not even that short, right? But of course, we're going to get into why everybody thinks he's short a little bit later on. It's mostly due to the Brits for making fun of him. But what we need to understand, though, is when he does graduate from military school, he joins the French army in 1785, right? And when he joins the French army, he shows a lot of potential at being a great leader and using new military tactics like lightning fast attacks using multiple different units, and also he becomes a lieutenant in the artillery division, right? And so as an officer in the army, he then actually is around when the revolution breaks out, right? And the revolution itself breaks out in 1789, a mere 4 years after his induction into the military, right? But what's going to end up going down, though, is he supports the revolution. Something we have to understand about Napoleon is when the revolution broke out, he highly supported it, right? He stayed inside the French military. He did not leave nor run away, because something we have to understand is a lot of these figures, okay, keep this in the back of your mind, all right, right back here, a lot of different figures that actually led the military before the revolution were your old sword nobles, right? Your Marquis de Lafayette's and several other figures like that. Well, Marquis de Lafayette supported the revolution. Not every single sword noble did. And so a lot of them are going to actually run away, and they become what is known as émigrés, right? And émigrés means people that ran to other countries because they were afraid of what the revolution might cause, right? What's going to end up happening, though, is now that several different officers have ran away from the revolution and now have gone to other countries, what's going to happen is Napoleon is going to use this to his advantage, and he's going to quickly rise through the ranks, right? And he does this by winning several big battles against the Prussians, the Austrians, but the biggest one he wins is against the English at this place called the Siege of Toulon. Now, so like the Toulon is a very small French city in the southern area of the country, and what had happened was they kind of stopped listening to the leadership of the government, or excuse me, let me rephrase. Toulon is a small city in the south of France. They stopped listening to the Committee of Public Safety and would be considered counter-revolutionaries during the Reign of Terror, right? Toulon started trading with the British. They started trying to operate on their own. And what's going to end up happening is the Committee of Public Safety sends an army down there to take them over and to issue justice, right? And leading that army was none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, right? He showed up, he used his artillery to actually go after the British, and he ran them completely out. And then Napoleon shot everybody that, like, in Toulon that was actually going against the revolution, which is going to be a really, really big deal, though, because once he actually does this at Toulon, he's going to start earning the trust of what you know as the Committee of Public Safety, right? The Committee of Public Safety and Maximilien Robespierre, while he was still alive, because yes, we have traveled backwards in time yet again, which I know makes a lot of you really sad, but Napoleon actually impressed Danton and impressed Maximilien Robespierre with his ability to lead an army against the English, which is not, which as we can recall, is not any small feat, right? The English are a very large military. They are pretty much the most powerful military in the world. So the fact that this young general kind of shoved it all back in their face was a really, really, really big deal, right? So what's going to end up going down, though, is he's going to end up getting elected general by the Committee of Public Safety at a very, very young age, while he actually does this whole thing, and he actually sieges Toulon and takes it over. But then, as we know, what's going to happen in 1794, just about a year later, Robespierre is going to die, right? He ends up getting shot in the face. We don't know by who. He then ends up getting guillotined and stuff like that. He's dead, and the Directory replaces him. Well, what ends up going down, though, is that the new government, known as the Directory, did not trust Napoleon. They didn't trust anybody that was actually associated with Robespierre, and so they decided to have him arrested, right? They have Napoleon arrested, and for a couple of weeks, he spent some time in jail, right? Isn't that right, PB? All right, so, say hi to Miley. All right, so hi, PB. So, now, the thing that we need to understand, though, is he does get arrested, right? And he ends up being put in jail for a couple of weeks, but now he realizes, as the consummate opportunist, that he, just like he won the respect of Maximilien Robespierre, he needs to win the respect of the Directory. So what ends up happening is a very pivotal moment in his progression. Oh, sorry about that. His progression to rise to power is this thing known as the whiff of grape shot, which is another big thing that the College Board never wants me to talk about. about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, just so you can understand where the heck this guy came from, okay? Something that you have to understand about Napoleon while you're talking about him is he is an opportunist, right? If he sees an opportunity, he's going to take it every single time. So what ended up happening is the Directory, as we already know, is 5 guys that form an executive branch, and they worked with this thing called the Council of 500, which are basically 500 representatives in France to kind of serve as a legislative body, right? But what ends up going down, though, is a lot of the people that are still living in France don't like the Directory because they think they're boring and they think they're ineffective. Just like I think they're boring and ineffective, right? So what ends up going down, though, is a mob of sans-culottes, right? Those people that, of course, have no pants, and the poor, like, rioters of Paris decided that they one day wanted to attack the Directory, right? They decide that they're going to assemble a small mob and that they're going to go over there and try to overthrow the government. Well, what Napoleon does is he hears about this attack a little early after he's been released from jail, and he decides that he's going to bring a stop to that to earn the respect of the Directory and get reinstated back into the French military. And so he does this thing known as the whiff of grape shot, where he actually has a bunch of cannons loaded, and he actually allows that the poor people to charge at him. He then says, wait. He gives them a threat. He says, if you come any closer, we're going to fire upon you. The sans-culottes kept running up, and so they shot them. So, like, no, he actually shot them with what is known as grape shot, which is instead of, like, one big cannonball, a bunch of small ones, right? And he ends up killing a lot of people in that crowd of sans-culottes, and he actually ends up earning the respect of the Directory, though, because they're like, we like this guy. We like the cut of his jib. He's willing to shoot people for us. So he ends up actually getting reinstated into the military after that and earns back his position of general. And so once that actually occurs, he then gets control of the French military, and the Directory basically asks him, where do you want to go, right? And he, as the general of the military, decides that he wants to try and go and attack his biggest rival. Napoleon is going to try and use this new direction and this new, position in the military that is now sanctioned by the new government under the Directory, and he wants to go after the British, right? So he wants to attack the British for a lot of different reasons, but the chief reason why is due to the fact that, one, he sees them as France's greatest rival, and also he just doesn't like them. Right? So, yeah, he sees them as the largest rival, and he also just doesn't like them, right? So he sees the fact that the British are the most powerful country out there. Their maritime influence is huge. They have a massive navy. It's super scary and really intense. How much land they control and how much stuff they own. So what he decides he wants to do is he wants to knock them down a peg or two. But also, something that you have to understand as well is that the British media had a habit of making fun of him a lot. So British periodicals and magazines and artists and stuff like that would draw a bunch of really demeaning cartoons of him, and that's why everyone thought he was short, right? Because the thing about it is the British said he was short. They called him the Little General. They called him all these bad, mean names. They said he was like a sociopath. They said, not a sociopath, that word didn't exist at the time. They said he was bloodthirsty when he shot all those people at Toulon. So he just really doesn't like them, and he wants to attack them, right? And so what he decides to do in this process to to affect the British is he wants to attack their wallet, okay? Because the thing that you do not do whenever you're trying to kind of stick one to the British is you don't attack them directly. No one invades British directly, right? The British directly. It's only ever happened one time in history recently, and that was in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution when William of Orange was invited by the British to invade, right? So, the only time you're taking over the British is if they tell you to come on over and do it. So he wanted to go and invade Egypt instead. Now, the reason why he wants to invade Egypt is really, really important geographically, okay? So when you look at the existence of the large-scale network and trade network that the British East India Company had established, it's all about getting to India, right? Well, the thing about it is that the Portuguese and the Dutch were the ones who went all the way around Africa to get to India. But the British realized that you could cut the trip in half if you sailed through this thing called the Strait of Gibraltar, which is the waterway that separates Spain and Morocco in northern Africa, go through the Mediterranean, around Italy, get to Egypt, hop off, and then go to the Red Sea and hop back on again, and you can get to India that way, right? But here's the cog and the key piece. It's Egypt, right? And so Napoleon was like, look, if we cut Egypt out of the picture, they will be forced to go all the way around Africa, depleting their funds, depleting their goods, and really, really struggle, or basically crippling their trade networks, right? Now, what ends up happening, though, when he decides to go and invade Egypt, he does have some early big victories, right? But something that's happening is a trend of Napoleonic warfare is beginning to kind of like rear its ugly head, right? And that's the fact that Napoleon can win battles on the ground, right? If he has hard ground underneath him and soil and dirt, he can use like that ground, not use the ground, but he can win those battles, right? He can use his artillery, his cavalry, and his infantry to win big victories, right? And he had several big victories against Ottoman Empire armies that were allied with the British at the time. At the Battle of the Pyramids and at the Battle of Cairo, he ends up actually winning those. But the invasion overall was a massive failure when he lost the biggest naval battle that would have decided the entire progression of the invasion. He lost it in a humiliating way as well. And the battle, by the way, was called the Battle of the Nile. He lost to this guy named Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was the admiralty and leader of the British Navy at the time. Now, this is what Admiral Nelson looked like, and it's like, I know some of y'all are like, oh, well, Admiral Nelson doesn't look too terrible. It looks like he might actually be a pretty ferocious dude. Not at all, actually, because he's blind in one eye and he's missing an arm, and it really demonstrates to us that people with disabilities are not people to be discounted, right? But he actually, we'll talk about why he's missing an arm, why he was blind in one eye, and all this other stuff. But what ends up happening, though, is that he becomes a very, very big kind of figurehead in the British military that Napoleon starts to hate with a fiery passion. But Admiral Horatio Nelson, though, is going to be the guy that he can never defeat in battle. Napoleon never actually bests the Admiral Nelson or ever beats the British Navy in a one-on-one fight. And so what we need to understand, though, is that this whole thing is a massive failure. So what he does do is he abandons his army inside of Egypt. But when he gets back to France, everyone's cheering his name, and they're like, yeah, Napoleon, you're the man. So he comes back home to a hero's welcome. But why? That doesn't make any sense. He just literally left an army back in Egypt, and he lost to the big invasion, like the last battle at the Battle of the Nile. So why are they excited that he's back if he lost? Well, the thing about it that y'all have to understand, word doesn't travel that fast in the 1790s, right? Okay, like in 1799, when he returns to France, not a lot of people are going to know that he lost anything. They're only going to have heard about the victories he had at like Cairo and Pyramids. They're not going to know that the Battle of the Nile was a big failure. So he used this popularity to seize power and to overthrow the Directory. And what he did was this thing known as the coup d'etat of 1799. Highlight this, it's a very big moment in history. In the coup d'etat of 1799, Napoleon overthrows the Directory and he ends up bringing in his own power, right? He actually overthrows it in what is known as a coup d'etat or a coup. And what that is a sudden seizure of power or overthrow of a government. Think of it like a revolution in a day, right? So he uses the military that still heavily supports him, because something that you have to understand about Napoleon is, say what you will about him, but he is a good general. He fights alongside of his men. He tries to save as many French lives as he can. But the thing that you have to understand is that he's just like good at leading them. And they look to him as being a great leader. And so when he shows up in France and says, hey, let's go overthrow the really boring and ineffective Directory, the military backs him and they go in there with him. They show up at a meeting of the Council of 500 in the Directory and they overthrow the entirety of the government in one day, right? In 1799, he overthrows it and he establishes himself as the first consul of France, right? Now, what that is, okay, is very important, because what he creates, though, when he gets rid of the Directory, he replaces it with, instead of a 5-man branch, he creates a 3-man executive branch known as the consulate. But he established himself as what is known as the first consul. Now, the thing about it is that we need to understand is that title or rank of first consul is basically going to make him the president, king, leader of France now, right? But the thing he's trying to do, though, is he's trying to invoke a lot of old Roman symbolism, right? So the Romans, all right, or the ancient Romans, I'm sure y'all learned about a bunch of this stuff in Miss Urso, they had a republican-style government, and republics are ruled by the people, right? Ruled by the people sounds really, really great, right? It sounds like this idea that, like, oh, I actively will have a choice, and I will actively have a voice in my government, and that's something that the Romans were very well known for. There were 2 consuls that ruled over the, Roman Republic during times of peace, right? So the thing about it that he's going to shift up a little bit is he's going to make it a 3-man branch instead of 2, and he's going to invoke a lot of this old Roman symbolism and grandeur, right? Trying to be like, oh, hey, we're going to be like the mighty Romans, and we're going to expand our empire, and we're going to be one of the biggest influences in the world, right? And he wants to basically kind of convince the French people that this is not a leadership under me, it's a leadership under all of us, which is kind of a lie, because he literally drafted a brand new constitution that would give him pretty much ultimate power over the government. And when he was doing this whole thing, he kept posting results of these things called plebiscites. Now, what a plebiscite is a vote, right? So basically, he would hold votes of every single person in France, or excuse me, every man in France was allowed to vote if they approved of this new government and of Napoleon being the first consul. And when he held these plebiscites for the new constitution being drafted and for the fact of him being first consul and overthrowing the directory, it came back at over a 90% approval rating, that over 90% of the French people really wanted him to be in power. Well, the thing about it is these things were oftentimes rigged and fraudulent, right? And he just basically wanted to create them to make it look like everyone in France wanted him in power, right? So the thing about it, though, is that Napoleon is going to do this, and he is going to come to power as the consul of France, right? And we will talk about his early reign in class when I see y'all on Tuesday, okay? So we'll wrap it up right here. I'll see y'all on Tuesday. We'll start talking about Napoleon, some of the big things he does early on, and how his early reign has both huge positives and huge negatives going forward in history, okay? But I'll see y'all soon. Yeah.